talk about the future and keep exploring what that future might look like. Engineers and scientists, we can predict how waste will behave and how long radioactive storage facilities will last. But it's hard to be precise about how people will feel in the future about the waste and how the society's values will evolve. In fact, it's hard to know what society will look like in the distant future. That's why we need fresh ideas about the types of possible futures in, say, 100 years, 1,000 years, or even 10,000 years. This will help us put context around the strategy, keeping our minds open to the possible paths ahead. To get some insight into this, we're glad to welcome Leah Zaidi, the founder of Multiverse Design. Leah is an award-winning futurist, and she has worked in strategic foresight analysis at Accelerated by Design and at Gensler. Her practice includes creating experiential futures to understand complex issues, a perfect skill set for our summit. Over to you, Leah.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. I'm very excited to join you and hopefully give you some different perspectives on the future and where things could go. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and launch off into a discussion about how things could change and how society could look very different than what it does right now. So here we go on a journey. So in 2020, the world changed. I don't think I need to tell you exactly how it changed because you're living it and you're experiencing it still. But it's a very good example in terms of going through this process of a pandemic where we see like the world can really change drastically and very quickly in ways that we don't anticipate. And so that's one of the key lessons that we learned from COVID is that we can't expect things to continue on the trajectory that they're on and assume that the future will look exactly the way the present does. Really, it can shift drastically around us. We can enact policies fairly quickly. We can see our systems break down, and we did see our systems break down. And we can learn exactly how it is that we respond when we're faced with a crisis. And, some of us were very ill prepared as nations, as communities to deal with the crisis that we were facing. And we learned some positive lessons too. So one of the things that we learned is that funding and following science can really transform the world. The experience that we're having with a vaccine, a vaccine that's developed within 9 months that has, upwards of 95% efficacy is the ideal scenario that we could have hoped for a vaccine. It's one of the best case scenarios. And so there is room for transformation, there is room for growth, there is room to respond to crisis, but at the same time, this is not the last crisis we're going to be facing. We really don't understand the consequences of climate change and what we're looking at on the horizon. And so it becomes really important to understand the future and where things could go, particularly over long-term time horizons, because things can change drastically and we need to be prepared for those changes, especially when we think about the world that we're creating together and the world that we're going to leave behind for future generations. So before we dive into what the future might look like, I want to bring everybody up to speed on what we're talking about today and give you the baseline understanding of what strategic foresight is and how we do foresight work. So foresight is fundamentally different from forecasting. Forecasting is all about prediction. And forecasting, we're taking lots of evidence, lots of data, we're narrowing down and we're making predictions about what the future is. And this is really useful when we're talking about things like COVID, where there is scientific evidence, where we can model simulations and look at how the cases might play out. But it's not so good when we're trying to figure out, how might different countries respond? What is the role of leadership? What are the behaviors that we're going to see emerge in society? The politicization of mass, for instance, is not something that forecasting can tell us. And that's where foresight comes in. So foresight is fundamentally the opposite of forecasting. What we're doing instead is that we're looking at those broad possibilities of where the future could go, and then working backwards to understand what do we do in the present to account for those emerging possibilities, knowing that the future could go in many different directions. And so it's still evidence-based. We're not, going fully into science fiction and throwing out reality altogether. What we're doing is we're looking for signals of change, evidence that the world might be a little bit different. And that's really fundamentally what the work starts with. It's looking at, those little pieces of evidence that say something could be different about the future. And then we take those signals, we put them together, we think about what the implications of those could be, and we create scenarios of the future. So we might look out, in terms of nuclear waste, 100 years, 200 years, 300 years into the future, and think about those scenarios. So this is one model for creating scenarios. This is called generic images of the future. And these scenarios are diverging types of futures, archetypes that may come about. Now, in a non-COVID world, we were in a continuation scenario. So pre-COVID, it was all about economic growth, business as usual, more of the same. And then when COVID started, we kicked into a discipline scenario where it became about order and control. So part of that is top-down control, like policy measures, and part of that is bottom-up control. So what we as citizens are doing to make sure that we're keeping each other safe and keeping ourselves safe. Now, we're still in the discipline scenario. We're getting to the tail end of it, especially with the vaccines coming out. But, on the horizon, if we look towards, again, the next crisis, which could potentially be climate change, we're looking at a collapse scenario. And that's when the system breaks down. That's when, things no longer function the way we need them to. We saw a little bit of collapse throughout COVID, but we mostly saw discipline. We also saw a little bit of continuation and a little bit of transformation, because of course the present is complex. And then what we really want to go towards, ideally coming out of this, is transformation. That is the high-spirited world where we resolve some of our systemic issues, if not all of them. And that's not a utopia. It's not a perfect world. It's a world in which we achieve sustainability in the broadest sense. So sustainability not only environmentally, but in our political and economic systems as well. And so these are the kind of scenarios that we look at when we think about the future, and we ultimately want to use those scenarios to get to the point of developing strategies. So scenarios are really just prototypes of the future that we use to better understand what we're going to do today. It's really about the present day actions that we want to take ultimately in the end. And so why do we look so far into the future? What's the value of looking 100 to 300 years ahead? Well, the nuclear waste issue is definitely one that requires that long-term thinking, and it requires those longer time horizons. But by doing so, by thinking about, what this issue could turn into in the future, what society could look like, what are the issues that they're grappling with, we can break out of our current paradigms, the thinking that we're stuck in right now, that dictates how we should go about things, and look at things when they're radically different, right? So in 2019, how many people imagined that we'd be in a global pandemic in this situation where we would be in a lockdown, experiencing the inequalities that we're experiencing, experiencing economic distress. And so that was hard to imagine even just 2 years ago. And so looking into the far future, things can change drastically in ways that we haven't even anticipated. And so we want to be able to explore some of those ways that are unexpected. And we also want to challenge our imaginations. We want to push ourselves. Novelty, from the future, borrowing from the future, can produce innovation and new thinking today. And so by stretching our imaginations, we force ourselves to be more creative with the solutions that we're creating. And we use those extremes to innovate. We think about, what is it from the future that we can take to do now and to bring about now, so that we're pulling that future into the present rather than leaving it as an abstraction that's far off and not achieved. And that can not just be like for technological innovation, but also, how society transforms overall as a whole. And so if you look back over the past 100 years, things have changed so drastically. We as people tend to underestimate change. Like, even if you think back to the past 10 years of your life, think about how much that has changed, how much you've changed as a person. The next 10 years is going to bring a lot more change too. But we have a hard time grappling with just how much change can happen within a short period of time. And so 100 years ago, that's when horses really got displaced by cars. it's hard to think about a society now where, you know, we would have horses running around on streets, whether or not we would really even have streets, the same way society is structured at this time. But that's a change that's really taken place within the last 100 years. And as we go through this pandemic, again, 100 years later, because the Spanish flu was 100 years ago, as we look to the next few years, you know, we're already experiencing another change in terms of vehicles. We're seeing electric vehicles emerge. This has been the catalyst for that. So more change coming up ahead as a result of that. The personal computer, where would this pandemic take us if we didn't have the technology that we've had today? It would be a very different reality we would be living in. And so the personal computer was really not invented until 1974. That's really within our lifetimes. We can look back at that and you know, think about how drastic of a change it has been for computers to come into the home. And I would argue that really it wasn't until 1990s that we started to see, you know, the computer as a household, a common household product, where kids were growing up with it and such. So, you know, this idea of having this device that's connected to the internet it's paradigm altering. It's altered our world in so many ways, and it's a very recent addition to our reality. And so if we start to march forward even more and think about the consequences that, you know, we have on a systemic scale, in 1984, this was the Arctic ice shelf, and there was approximately 1.86 million square kilometers of old ice in 1984. And just a few decades later, that shrunk down to about 110,000 square kilometers. That's a drastic change. And so that drastic change has all sorts of systemic consequences for the world that we're living in, and could radically change the world and the shape of the world, how it looks going forward. We're not just talking about, you know, an inconvenience. We're talking about a fundamental change to the way our planet looks. And the consequences that has for people. This could potentially mean in the years ahead that entire nations are wiped off the earth. And so we have to think about some of these drastic changes that are coming up and the responsibility that we have to the future, particularly as we start to look at the next few generations. So the moral and ethical responsibility that we have to our children is something that we need to keep in mind. And this beautiful concept of 7 generations that comes from Indigenous communities of, you know, thinking ahead of what it means, you know, when we bring things into this world, the consequences of that for generations down the road. It used to be, and it still kind of is, that about 7 generations equals 140 years. That's changing. It's changing because we're living longer. It's changing because we're delaying having children, and it's changing because of technology. So there's technology like CRISPR, like gene editing, that could potentially shift how long we live, and who gets to live longer and who doesn't. There's inequalities that are built into that as well. And so the time span of what 7 generations could look like could change in the future too. And so we're in a very strange place in history right now where things are fluctuating. And this quote from Stephen Hawking, I think, kind of sums it up, particularly when we look at those longer term time horizons that nuclear waste needs thinking around, is that in a world that is in chaos politically, socially, and environmentally, how can the human race sustain another 100 years? And this was tied to, you know, other things that he vocalized around, do we have 100 years left? Like, is that it? Is that the time frame that we really have to, you know, save humanity, beyond which we're going to be in deep turmoil? So it's important to keep these time horizons in mind. And with that in mind, let's jump ahead and look at the world in the next 100 to 200 years. So I'm going to start with the continuation scenario. This is the business as usual scenario. This is a scenario that I'm calling artificial Earth. So with steady advances in technology that helps humanity merge with machines, you know, what does that look like? If we turn the world into machines around us, if we look at everything as through the lens of technology, if we alter our planet to reflect that and alter ourselves as well, does the Earth become a computer and we become an extension of that computer? It's radical thinking. You know, we don't think that that's going to happen, but there's evidence to support that now, little blips in the signals. And so unchecked entrepreneurship, you know, that gets to run rampant without policy intervention is one of those things. You know, policy is often slow to respond to technology and the changes that are coming about. And so if we don't regulate technology, if we don't think about the consequences ahead of time, we may be caught up in weird and strange, undesirable cycles. I also think, things like the fact that who gets to upgrade themselves is going to be an issue. You have people like Elon Musk talking about things like a neural lace, downloading themselves into computers, extending consciousness, linking consciousness. Who gets to do that? Who gets to afford that? Who gets to survive this change of the planet and changing of ourselves, as the planet starts to deteriorate. And I'm firmly of the opinion that, a continuation scenario where it's all focused on economic growth and business as usual leads to environmental disaster. And so if we think about, who gets to save themselves and who doesn't, that's a really important consideration that we need to keep in mind. And so the next scenario we're going to look at is discipline. This is the intelligent design scenario. And so again, discipline is all about order and control, right? Who has order, who inflicts order, who has control, who rebels against that control. And so in this scenario, we are thinking about human nature as the ultimate problem that is really plaguing society. And there is no real changing the world around us to fix things. Maybe what we have to do is evolve ourselves. Maybe we have to change ourselves. And then within a couple of generations, we may be transformed physically and psychologically, particularly as we start to meddle with ourselves. So the technology that's coming up, like CRISPR, could contribute to that, of editing out our nature. And so that's going to have all sorts of consequences. If we try to eliminate the worst of ourselves, like violence and greed and war, that could be, on the surface level, a great thing. We think of that as a positive. But does that also mean that socially we become more homogenous? Do we erode art in the process? Do we erode passion in the process? Do we take away diversity in the process? And that would be a very ugly thing for us to do. And so we don't really fully understand the consequences of some of the technology that we're creating, but it could mean that we are altering our very nature itself. And then what humanity is completely different than humanity as we understand it now. Collapse. So this is the scenario that's, usually easy for everyone to grasp, because we can all sort of grasp the dystopia and how things can go horribly wrong. But maybe we'll see a scenario like feudal compounds. So in 100 years, if the Earth warms by, let's say, 4 degrees, it could put an end to civilization as we know it. So there are scientists that have speculated that 4 degrees means that the planet's carrying capacity drops to 1 billion. So if there's 8 billion of us now, and the carrying capacity drops to 1 billion, what does that really mean? There's all sorts of consequences that will be triggered by climate change, but climate change is really just one aspect of environmental problems. We know that biodiversity loss is another looming threat. Waste is definitely a threat as well, as we think about, the future of the planet, waste overall, and then certainly nuclear waste. And then, we think about what does that mean for political stability when you have conditions of unrest caused by changing climate. And there is definitely a relationship between, climate and temperature and violence. So we have to keep that in mind. But with, the planet deteriorating, is it possible that Canada becomes a refuge with fresh water and thawed northern soils? So I don't necessarily think life is going to be easy, or, if that is even a possibility if we start to see things like ocean acidification and soil erosion, but let's play with that construct. And so within that construct, if we start to get more feudal compounds, we have these walled communities that are led by demigods, then we have a situation where, it becomes very mistrustful. Fanaticism rules. There's a lot of hostility. We're looking at climate genocide with, many people being wiped out around the world, such a devastating sort of vision of the planet. And then, coupled with that, this fear of others, of what it means to protect yourself and to survive. And so, we're going to see all sorts of inequalities pop up within that context. The rich are already starting to potentially build their bunkers and look for ways out of this problem. We saw, with the situation in Texas with the erratic weather that kicked in, the first thing Ted Cruz did was take off, right? Book a vacation. And so that's the potential sort of behavior that we can expect coming out. And then transformation. So this is the scenario we hope for. This is the scenario that we might want to bring about. But I want to caution you as well in terms of transformation, because we tend to think that transformation means good for everybody equally. It doesn't necessarily, right? The same way it's possible for some people to thrive within a systemic breakdown. If we look at COVID, COVID didn't happen equally to everyone. There were all sorts of inequalities that came up, and it revealed so many cracks within our systems. The same thing is possible within transformation too. Transformation could leave some people behind. It could also create some inequalities in the process. But we're talking again here about sustainable systems, right? Not the utopia, not the perfect system. So here we see, a potential near collapse paving the way for something much better. If we look at the evidence in terms of what we're doing, we're not doing enough for transformation, but maybe, if things get a little bit worse, we're likely to respond, we're going to innovate, we're going to come together in the way that, COVID didn't bring us together. So if we put people and planet first, if we undertake widespread systemic reform, we root out oppression, we really work on, who it is that we need to be, incorporating the beautiful aspects of 7th generation into our thinking, can we get to a future that is climate positive and positive for future generations as well? And so here we see things like a decentralized and distributed model of power. We see experts who lead us in various ways, not just scientific, but people who have expertise in social realities and economic realities and so on and so forth. We get past the whole thing around party politics, where we're adhering to these 4-year election cycles that dictate what the future should be, rather than thinking about the values that we need to embody and the future that we need to have, and then working backwards from there. And so this idea around a decolonized, diverse, and equitable future becomes a reality, because we're working actively towards dismantling the systems that we have and then replacing them with the transformation that we hope to see in the future. And again, that's enabled by a number of things. It could be things like climate positive policies, for instance, where again, that respect for the generations that are coming, for the reality that we're facing, the planet that we're on, becomes at the forefront of everything that we do. And so the long-term thinking horizon is really built into society as a whole. And so those are the kinds of futures that we could be exploring. And as you go forward and you think about, what is possible, there's a whole bunch of other things that could lie ahead as well. And that's just, an incremental step on the way to a larger future and to a longer future. So when we get way past, 100 years and we start to look into 10,000 years, a timeline for which there is very little evidence, we can't necessarily paint a picture of the future, but we can start to think about radical change in a way that challenges our very basic assumptions about what the future is and about who we are within that future. And again, the reason why we do that is to push our imaginations and to really think about problems in a way that we're not thinking about them now. And so in 10,000 years, what could the future hold? Well, we can ask some interesting questions about it. So what if we redirect our evolution? What if we take an active role in it and find a way to become, immune to radioactivity? What if we treat the Earth like a trash can? If this is not the final destination that we're on, and we decide that we've wrecked it so badly that there's no salvaging it, and we might as well destroy it fully. Not necessarily a good future, but a provocative question. What if we find new use for waste? Things that we haven't even thought of yet that could be of benefit to future generations. And what if we haven't produced enough of it? Like, what if we need more waste, which is completely counterintuitive to our thinking now? What if we discover a new element? What happens if the storyline of Black Panther comes through, if we find a vibranium that has all sorts of transformative possibilities and we can shape society around it? What if space exploration produces a new energy source that we haven't even thought of yet? Something that's not available on Earth, but could easily be brought to Earth and could change society. That's a very strange sort of thing to think about and what that could be, but it's an interesting question again. And then in 10,000 years, what if the metaverse becomes a more desirable reality? So if living in the digital world is much more desirable than living in this particular world, then we need to think about that. That's really not even a question for 10,000 years, if I'm being honest. It's more of a question for today because the metaverse is emerging. But what if we take that to the full extreme where consciousness is really just a digital thing? And then if humanity evolves into different species, what does that mean for us, right? 10,000 years ago, there were still Neanderthals. So if in 10,000 years, if there's a different hominid species that exists because we've branched off into those different species, what does that mean for us? And then what if we eliminate all the things that make us diverse and unique and, that really add all sorts of vibrancy and color to our lives? If we eliminate things like gender, sex, sexuality, what does that mean for us? What are the implications of that? And what if we become a multi-planet species? If companies like SpaceX succeed and we're able to colonize Mars and we're able to jump from Mars to another planet, if we discover that wormholes are in fact portals to other places, what does that mean for humanity? And should we really be even looking at leaving the planet when we haven't resolved some of the worst of ourselves? And then finally, what does it mean if we go extinct? Our place on this planet is not guaranteed. And if we keep marching down the road that we're on, it's entirely possible that, we're marching towards our end. So if humanity goes extinct, what does that mean for the planet and for all other life on it? I've seen this pop up every once in a while that, if the bees disappear, all life on this planet would suffer as a result of it. But if humans disappear, all other life on this planet would flourish. So that's something to think about in terms of, our place in the broader ecosystems, but also the legacy that we're leaving behind in this world. And so I hope that gives you a lot to think about and provokes a lot of new thinking. I'm really excited to see what the questions are in terms of the things that you guys have been sharing in the chat function. But thank you for your time and for going on this journey with me. I hope I didn't alarm you too much about the future, but I gave you some new perspectives to think about. And so from that, we're going to jump right into the questions. So it can be a little bit daunting to think about the future and to think about how life can radically change. But I do want to point out this concept of effective forecasting if you want to look into it. It's really important for thinking about your own personal future as well. So there was a study done at Harvard that showed that, even when we're forced to think about the past 10 years of our lives, how much we've changed as individuals, our personalities, the relationships that we have, the work that we're doing. Even when we do that, it becomes difficult for us to look at the 10 years ahead of us and understand the change that's going to be involved in those 10 years. So if you think about just yourself and how much you're going to change, there's so much that's going to happen over the next 10 years to you. And so extending that out to the system can be even more challenging and complicated when we look at what is the result of all of us being different than we are right now. And what does that mean when we extend that out? So yes, the presentation will be shared. You will, I believe the video will also be shared in some capacity. So you will get to see this material again. No questions, but okay. I can keep talking about other things if nobody has any questions to ask. Let me think about what else I think is important to consider. I will say that it's challenging for us to think about a transformation future, partly because sometimes when we create these prototypes of the future, we forget that humanity will still be humanity, that people will still be people. And so whenever we're thinking about what we're designing, what we're changing, the transformations that we want to seek, we have to still be honest about how people behave and who we are and how we're going to respond. So always thinking about a spectrum of ourselves in terms of our behavior and all of that stuff, rather than the idealized version of ourselves, is very important. We've got a question here about government. Does government make use of foresight analysis? Yes, governments are increasingly using foresight around the world to think about the future. So are private organizations as well. In Canada, we do have a group called Policy Horizons that works within the Canadian government to look at the future. There are various futurists like myself that do work with the government organizations around the world. So not only national governments, provincial and municipal, but also NGOs and bigger organizations like the UN. So this work is definitely being incorporated. We are behind in Canada, though I would say we could do a much better job. And I'm not sure if the Canadian government is really aware of the fact that this is a full-blown capacity that exists in Canada. There's lots of futurists here, and we have one of the best pipelines in the world coming out of OCAD University as well that's feeding work all around the world. With all of the unknowns, where does that lead on waste policy? There are so many unknowns that what we really ultimately want to do is explore what those different possibilities could be, and then look for strategies that hold up regardless of what possibility emerges. So there are some strategies that are fairly robust that once we do the work, we have to do the work first. Once we do the foresight work, it should reveal certain things in terms of like, this is a strategy that will hold up, whether the future goes towards a continuation scenario or towards a collapse scenario, and we need to think about what those are. But that's a fairly involved project that we would have to take on to do. And I think maybe we have time for one more questions. How do you engage others of different cultures, socio-political views, technical backgrounds to come up with possible futures? There are lots of efforts around participatory foresight. So one of the things that we do as futurists is that, I went off and built these scenarios, but I could have just as easily gathered a group together to, get your insights on what those futures should be, raise a whole bunch of different perspectives, have a bunch of different conversations, and then use that as material that feeds into a master set. And so scenarios, when they're done really well, should be treated as an evolving product or an evolving prototype that can be altered with different perspectives, that are malleable enough, that can be tossed away and redone. And so it's important, particularly when we're looking at complex issues, to get a variety of perspectives into the mix. And I think that's about as much as we have time for. I'll see if I can squeeze in one more question. Oh, no, I think we're done. Thank you so much for having me here today. This was such a pleasure, and I hope that you got value out of this conversation and that you continue thinking about the future as you go forward, particularly when it comes to the complex issues that you are grappling with. The future will continue to change, but the best way that we have to understand it is to really look at what's emerging and then thinking about what we can do in the present day to bring about the futures that we want to see happen for everyone.
I just want to take a minute to reflect on the presentation we just had from Leah Zaidi. I was reading with great interest your comments in the chat and the questions that were being asked. And, today is all about context setting, helping us lay out the foundation for our discussions that'll take part in the next 2 days, and also to help us with the strategy. So we thought that it was important for us to take a look at what the future might look like, or to at least think about it for a minute, so that it can help inform us when we start looking at those options. I saw a lot of conversations about, well, what does that mean for rolling stewardship? What does that mean for institutional control? And so I think that this, the talk that Leah gave will help start a discussion that maybe has been missing out of some of these conversations about the long-term management of radioactive waste.